Hi, welcome to today's chat on understood.org. Today we're going to be talking about writing instruction for kids with dysgraphia. Kids with dysgraphia can experience difficulty in two areas: the mechanics of handwriting and expressing ideas in writing. So today we've brought in Dr. Gary Troia, who is the Associate Professor of Special Education at Michigan State University, and he'll be talking with us about effective strategies to help your child with dysgraphia become a more efficient writer. So, Dr. Troia, thank you so much for your time and for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you for having me. My pleasure. So I was a speech-language pathologist in the public schools for about 10 years. And I worked with students who had language and literacy-based difficulties in self-contained classrooms, as well as an itinerant speech-language pathologist where I provided all kinds of services to children in preschool all the way up through high school. Then I became a professor, and I've been doing research on writing development and instruction and assessment for almost 20 years now. Writing is one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'm excited to be able to share what I can.
We're so lucky to have you and your incredible background here to help our parents. So we're going to dive right in. I see we've already got some parents on the line. For those of you who are new and haven't joined us for a video chat yet, it's super simple. Just ask your question in the chat box, and if we have time, we'll get to it. We get to as many as we can in the allotted time. We do ask that you give us as much context as possible in your question, so the age of your child, the grade of your child, things that might help Dr. Troia as he's answering your questions. We're going to dive right in with a starting question. Dr. Troia, can you give me an example of a writing technique that a writing specialist would use when working with a child with dysgraphia?
Sure. So a couple things come to mind. Students with dysgraphia often struggle with the mechanics of writing, as you said. That's one area that's often impacted. And so that means that they have difficulties with handwriting and spelling. And so a handwriting activity or exercise that a writing specialist might use with a student with dysgraphia who struggles in that area would be what we call a faded modeling technique. And so what that means is that students would be shown how to form the letter by using numbered arrows and dots, and where like the letter D would have, and we're talking about manuscript, would have the number 1 at the top of the first line, because that's going to be the first stroke, and the number 2 and a dot where the circle part of the D is. And that provides a model for the student, and it tells them which stroke they should use first and which direction. So there are arrows also that show the student that the first stroke should go down, and then the second stroke is the circle. And then the student would practice tracing over that, and then the model would be faded, so then there wouldn't be the numbers or the dots or the arrows eventually, and it would just be like what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of a dotted letter, and they would fill that in, and then they would have to produce the letter from memory. So they might copy from what they've seen and then cover it and then try to copy it or produce it again. And they would do that a few times. And it's not necessary that students write rows and rows of the same letter. So the practice is something that doesn't take a lot of time, maybe 10 minutes. But it's very helpful for kind of reinforcing and developing that motor memory for producing a letter.
I think that's a really interesting concept for parents, because it doesn't start with them producing the letter by itself in the beginning. It has gradual steps that help them grow and learn each of it. And for kids who struggle with it, it can be incredibly helpful.
Absolutely, yes. In terms of spelling, just another activity, this is a multi-sensory activity that a teacher might use with a student who's struggling in the area of spelling. And so it's a 3-step study strategy, because students typically are assigned words for spelling, maybe on a weekly basis. And they often have difficulty remembering those words and remembering how to spell them. And so they need a study strategy. So a 3-step study strategy that's multisensory would be, step 1 would be look and say, step 2 would be cover and see, and step 3 would be write and check. And so the first step, look and say, is they look at the word that they're studying and they say it out loud, and then they spell the word out loud. The second step, cover and see, they cover the word. They try to see the word in their mind. They trace the letters in the air, and then they say the word out loud and trace it again. Then the third step, write and check, they cover the word that they're looking at and write the word from memory. Then they check the word that they wrote against the original word to make sure the spelling is correct. And if they got it correct, they can write it a couple more times, again, to practice and develop that motor memory that's associated with the spelling. And if they didn't get it correct, they go back to step 1 and try the study strategy again.
Oh, I love that. I think that's like a very actionable item and tool that parents watching today can take and start with their kids as soon as this chat is over. We have questions coming in from parents, so I'm going to switch directions a little bit. This question comes from a user named Mom of J, and she says she needs ideas for how to help a child that has trouble getting ideas from his head down on paper. He's in 6th grade and has a lot of writing to do now and is struggling with getting the concepts on paper.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a lot of reasons why a student might be struggling with getting ideas down on paper. So let's assume that her child is okay with the mechanics of writing. If the mechanics were a problem, then we might think about adaptations such as using technology to kind of bypass the difficulties with the mechanics. But let's say mechanics are okay and the student is really struggling with kind of, again, just kind of generating ideas and getting those ideas down on paper. I think planning strategies are a great resource for teachers and parents, and they can run the gamut from very simple strategies like POW stands for Plan, Organize, and Write. That's a very general kind of planning strategy for very young students. More sophisticated strategies use more sophisticated mnemonics for students to help them remember the steps of the strategy. So something like SPACE might be used to remember the different parts of the narrative. And so SPACE stands for setting, problems, actions, consequences, and emotions. And so one of the reasons that students might struggle with getting ideas down on paper is that they don't know what ideas they need to generate to fit the genre of the writing. And so anything that we can do, any kind of mnemonics we can give them to remember the genre elements are really going to help with that. And SPACE is one example of that.
This mother wrote in with a follow-up question to that. She said, also, do you have any graphic organizers that you recommend for helping with research papers or organizing that, which you kind of touched on a little bit, but is there specifically like graphic organizers with organizing information for some type of papers that he's now having to write in 6th grade?
Yeah, there are a slew of them available on the internet, of course. Some of them are good, some of them not as good. I think it's really important to remember that a graphic organizer has to present a way of recording ideas down on the graphic organizer that fit the structure of the text. And so, a common example of a really ineffective graphic organizer is a web. Webs are great for when you are discussing a particular topic. And so this might be a good graphic organizer for a topical paper. When you're describing a topic and you want to generate, kind of organizing principles about that topic, different categories of information, and then kind of flesh out the categories, you can do that with a web or a wheel and spokes. But that kind of graphic organizer, for example, doesn't work well for a persuasive paper because persuasive paper, you have to be for and against. You have to present ideas for and against your position. And so that doesn't lend itself well to doing that. So be mindful of when you're looking at graphic organizers, and again, many of them are available on the web, to think about whether or not the graphic organizer really is going to help the student kind of produce information in an organized way that fits the text structure that's being called for. The other thing I would just note that is really important to think about anytime we're asking students to plan in advance of writing is that we want to avoid having students write a lot of text when planning. It's one of the reasons a lot of students with disabilities and students without disabilities don't like their write, because we give them a planning strategy like a graphic organizer, and if they complete that graphic organizer with a lot of text, then it ends up becoming a draft and they won't change it. And so what we want to do is make sure that they generate idea words on a graphic organizer or short phrases for the ideas that they're going to represent on the graphic organizer or in an outline, which would be another kind of graphic organizer that students might use for an informational paper. And it should be very brief, and the idea words or phrases should be like triggers for the information that's stored in long-term memory that the student wants to recall as they're writing. And so we want to avoid having graphic organizers or plans that have a lot of text on them. So I've heard it said that using cave person talk when you're filling out a graphic organizer. So very brief single words or short phrases.
I like that it's not supposed to be the full paper. It's just kind of the framework to jog it.
That's right. You're jogging the memory. That's right.
To our users who are watching and specifically asked about that question, we have a couple examples. By no means are they all of them out there on understood.org. We'll drop the link to a couple examples that we've used into the chat box for you. But as Dr. Troia said, there are many examples out there on the internet. And keep in mind that the graphic organizer pairs well with the type of paper and type of writing that your student is doing, and is also age appropriate to your student as well.
Absolutely.
So we have another question coming in from a parent, and this one is from Kelly. I'm going to read it because it's a bit of a long question. Kelly is asking, do you have any specific recommendations for a 13-year-old who has been newly diagnosed with dysgraphia and is on the line between handwriting and learning to type and use a computer?
So I'll say some general things about that. So when students are learning to use the computer, learning how to type, it's important for them to build up enough speed with typing to be able to really use the computer successfully to draft text. And so the recommendation we have from the research literature is about 20 words per minute. That's what a student needs to be able to type to be able to successfully compose on a computer. So, of course, there are plenty of typing practice programs available for free, for download, that can help with that at home if the student is not getting typing practice in school. And that's a possibility because a lot of schools, they introduce that briefly in elementary school, and then it's kind of expected that students know how to type. And so if your child is just learning how to type, then you want to kind of reinforce good typing skills. But it doesn't have to be, they don't have to be like a fast typer, just 20 words a minute.
I think that's helpful for parents to have a bar to kind of know if their child is on track or not. So thank you for that. Our next question, I think, is something that you will be able to answer very well given your past experience. It's about parents relating to teachers about their children. So Maria asks, how do I explain dysgraphia to the teachers that don't understand it? My daughter, who is in 4th grade, can't get her ideas down on paper, but her language arts teacher insists that she's just being lazy.
Oh, that's unfortunate. It's not an issue of laziness. It's there are many things that could be going on. Again, I think often children with dysgraphia, they're really struggling with mechanics of writing, and so they can't get a lot down on paper because they are focusing so much cognitive effort on thinking about forming the letters and spelling the words accurately that there's really not much left over to actually come up with the ideas and put them into language that is appropriate for the text structure and the assignment. And so it's really important for the teacher to understand that the reason why there isn't much text being produced could be because the student's really struggling with spelling and handwriting and needs remediation in those areas. And again, students with dysgraphia, those are often the areas they struggle with. And then, another issue might be language issues. If the student is able to, for example, to verbally rehearse what they're going to say, what they want to write first, and then maybe kind of jot down some notes using a graphic organizer, for example, that can help the student kind of get further along with generating that text. But I think the question is, how do I convince the teacher that the student is struggling, not because they're lazy, but because they're really having difficulty? So I think the transcription issues and then motivation. If you are a writer who struggled for a long time, you're not going to be motivated. I mean, we don't like doing things that we're not good at. And so we have to give students really small successes so they start feeling a sense of accomplishment and they increase their motivation. So just small writing assignments where a student can be successful. Maybe I often use poetry as an entry point for students who are struggling with writing, and because it's free form, or it could be very formulaic for students who need kind of a structure, and they don't have to write a lot and they can have fun with it. And so I think those are important things for teachers to understand, that students need the space and the time to focus on transcription difficulties and also the support to get them to be able to organize and generate ideas in a meaningful way and also have fun while doing it so that they feel like there's a point to writing.
Yeah, I think the positive affirmations is such a key element, because when these kids are struggling, when they can celebrate those little wins, it'll go a long way in helping them make progress and continuing to move forward. This next question kind of touches on what you were talking a little bit before about, and this is from Terry. And Terry says, I have an 11-year-old diagnosed with dyslexia and dysgraphia. She can spell orally, but writes the wrong letters down, and she cannot copy things. Her vowels are not needed. I'm not quite sure what that means, but she's wondering how she can help her daughter who can say it, but can't get it down on paper or even copy it on paper.
So I think the three-step spelling study strategy I mentioned earlier might be very helpful because, again, it's multisensory. It's going to bring in, the oral component, the tactile component with the tracing in the air, kind of the visualization in the head, and the actual writing. And that is something I want to reinforce, that with spelling, it's really important that the student actually generates the letters, because the generating of the letters is what reinforces that what we call a mental graphemic image in one's mind. And so for words and individual letters, we have this image in our head that's tied to a motor plan, and making the connection between those two things is really important. So, for example, we wouldn't want students to work on spelling using like a word search, because that doesn't involve actually generating the individual letters that are used to spell a word. So I think that is probably going to help that student if that three-step spelling strategy.
And for those of you who are watching, if you can't quite remember that three-step spelling strategy, don't worry, because at the end of this chat, we take this recording and we put it on the archives on our website, so you can go back and reference this, write down exactly what that strategy was, and start putting it into action at home. Our next question is about a slightly older student. This question comes from Lucy, and she's asking for ideas for her 16-year-old who struggles with writing, specifically often writing the same idea, just in different words.
So that sounds like a student who maybe would benefit from exploring a topic by reading more about that topic, and again, planning strategies to help the student kind of formulate some ideas and generate some plans ahead of time that are, again, just kind of reminders of those bigger ideas that are stored in memory. I think a lot of students with writing difficulties struggle with that, translating the ideas into text. And but if the student is basically saying the same thing over and over again, then they need to generate more ideas. And so doing a lot more reading about a topic and then taking that reading material and using it as fodder for ideas for a planning, graphic organizer or outline or what have you, is going to be helpful and maybe kind of diversifying the ideas that the child comes up with in the writing assignments.
Yeah, I like that. If they can kind of have the plan beforehand that has those ideas separated, then they can follow that and write about each of those ideas separately to then put them together. This next question is definitely about the handwriting side of dysgraphia. And Ingrid is asking, when a student does have to write, my 15-year-old doesn't put spaces between his words. Do you have any recommendations for how to help him with this, to know that there should be spaces between each word?
Well, with younger students, what I've done and what a lot of teachers do is they ask the students to use their finger after each word to remind them that a space is needed between the one word to the next word. And so if we're talking about writing text on paper, that can be very helpful, I think. It's kind of, very low tech, but very appropriate, I think, to help students, just as a reminder that I need to put spacing in between my words. And another thing is to remind your child, your student, that the whole point of writing is communicating to others ideas, or communicating to yourself later on when you want to read something back that you've written. And so it has to be legible to be able to understand it, or for others to understand it. And so the whole point of making sure that there's spaces between words, for example, when handwriting, is so that it's legible, because if all the words kind of are strung together and don't have spaces, then it's really difficult to decipher those individual words. So just a, kind of a reminder, a prompt that why we're doing this is also going to be helpful.
This next question is a bit higher level, and I'm going to see if this is maybe potentially a little bit out of your wheelhouse, so if so, please just let us know, but I'm going to throw it to you to see if we can get an answer. A user from Denver is asking what the relationship between dysgraphia and dyslexic is. She specifically asked, is it possible to be dysgraphic and not dyslexic? And then she says she's confused by how the two interact.
Okay, that is a great question, and there is a lot of confusion in the field. Even among researchers, we don't all agree about how to define dysgraphia. And so the way I look at it is that dyslexia is one potential cause of dysgraphia. So if a child has dyslexia, if they have difficulty reading individual words, they may have difficulty spelling those words, because the sound symbol correspondences, the relationships between the letters and the sounds in spoken words may not be clear to students. They may have difficulty with forming those mental graphemic representations and long-term memory of what the word looks like. And so that's going to impact both their reading and their spelling. It's also possible for a student to be a fairly good reader, but still have difficulty with spelling. So we do see that there is, in some children, it's not a one-to-one correspondence, that you can have dysgraphia without actually having dyslexia. And then, of course, it depends on the definition that we use of dysgraphia. So if we think of dysgraphia just broadly as a disorder in written language, students who don't struggle with the transcription aspects of writing but still have difficulty with generating text, being on point with sticking to the topic, organizing their ideas effectively. Those could be language-based issues that come into play that may also be things that we would see in the reading. So they may have reading comprehension difficulties, and then they would have written expression difficulties, but they might be very successful with actually reading a text orally and also spelling words.
I think that's a super kind of helpful division of it for our parents, so thank you. And for you parents, you might want to dig a little deeper into it. We've just dropped one of our articles into the chat. We've got a couple articles about this on understood.org, so you can check out the article that we put in the chat box, and then there will kind of help you find some other resources. Once you get through that, the site will recommend a couple of related articles as well. So hopefully that will help. We see a follow-up question about dyslexia and dysgraphia, and the article that we just kind of dropped in there, it's now asking about dyspraxia. It'll cover kind of what each of those are. So yes. I would encourage you to check out that link. Our next question comes from a parent called named Naomi, and she says, my 9-year-old has dysgraphia and dyslexia. I spent a lot of money on occupational therapy, and I don't know whether I should go on that direction or focus on more tutoring. I'm just starting to see what help I can get from the school district as she was diagnosed last spring. So a fairly new diagnosis, and this parent is kind of wondering how to start getting support from the school versus just outside sources.
Well, I would think that if a student were diagnosed with both dyslexia and dysgraphia, is that right?
Yep.
That if you're going to go the route of getting outside help, then tutoring would definitely be a tall order, I would think, not just occupational therapy, because the occupational therapist is going to be able to work on the motor aspects that are involved with writing, with handwriting and maybe typing. But they're not going to have the expertise to deal with the reading issues and the larger issues around written expression.
That's really helpful for us. And we do have a couple articles on Understood about working with your school, Naomi, and specifically on the steps to take to get an IEP or 504 to start that conversation with your teachers in school and getting a support team. So we would recommend that you check that out. I think we have time for one last question before we have to let Dr. Troia go. And this comes from Homework Helper, who's asking, how does executive functioning impact dysgraphia? And does OT really work? My child was diagnosed 2 years ago and is 11. So this parent is wondering, with an 11-year-old who has executive functioning, what's the relationship between the two, and can OT help?
Okay, so a two-part question. So I'll tackle the OT first. Again, I think occupational therapy can be beneficial if there is motor, small motor or fine motor difficulties involved, and that is contributing to the writing problems. And so that's what we, have to look at in terms of the prescriptive information that comes from a diagnosis, is whether or not there appears to be motor issues. And then that would lead to, recruiting an occupational therapist to assist. The second part, in terms of executive function is really so critical to successful writing performance, because writing is one of the most difficult things that we can do as a human being, because we are coordinating simultaneously language knowledge, topic knowledge, genre knowledge, physical aspects of writing in terms of the handwriting or the typing, motivational aspects. And so all of that has to be juggled simultaneously, and that falls on executive functioning system. And so that's why successful writing instruction often capitalizes on using strategies to support students in going through the writing process, from pre-writing, planning, drafting, revising, and editing, strategies to support all that, as well as self-regulatory strategies. So strategies to help students set goals for themselves when they write, to use coaching, self-coaching when they are having struggles, to deal with those negative thoughts, feelings, and actions that are part and parcel of writing. Even very successful writers have to use that mental coaching to get through writing tasks because they do find it so challenging. Progress monitoring, so actually graphing performance over time, even if it's something as simple as how long I write for in a given day. How many minutes do I spend on writing, or how many words do I produce? And seeing if I can build up stamina with writing by increasing the amount of time or the number of words I produce. That might be, how you could monitor progress towards a goal. And then self-reinforcement. So, when you're successful as a writer, you want to reward yourself. Even those very small successes, pat yourself on the back, give yourself, praise, so that you feel good about that and you're going to want to do more in the future.
Awesome. We are right at time, so thank you so much, Dr. Troia. You've been incredibly insightful and given a lot of great tips to our parents today, so thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And to those of you who are watching, if you would like to reference this chat, you can find it at u.org/calendar. It'll be up sometime later this afternoon, and you can go back and see any of the tips over again. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions today, and we're sorry about that. So please go to u.org/community. We have incredible experts in our community who are answering questions. There's peer-to-peer coaching from other parents going through exactly what you're going through. So check out u.org/community, and it's another way to get great answers for those questions about your children. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you again in another chat. Have a great day.